be talking about the future of AI in HR and in the workplace, and how AI is helping to drive a whole new set of activities in working environments around coaching, leadership development, even just your regular daily activities of trying to maintain healthy balance and wellness at work. And so there's just a huge amount of activity in this space, and we're going to try to unveil a little bit of it. It's gigantic and emergent, and so we'll only cover a small amount today. But I just want to introduce myself, and then I'm going to hand it over to Carol, and we're still waiting for one more panelist. I hope we can get her in here, and then we'll get going. So my name is Beth Porter. I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Riff Analytics, and a second company called Esme Learning. And in both of those companies, we focus really on professional development, and in particular in the Riff Analytics, we are really focused on using AI to model behaviors in workplace settings, in learning settings, and toward the goal of helping people understand more about themselves, their style of communication, their style of interaction with others in real time, over time, in order to give them a better self and situational awareness. I'll stop there and hand it over to Carol.
Oh, Beth, I have a quick question. Have the people here actually seen how your thingy works? So do they actually have this?
Probably not.
So guys, here's just a little description of Beth's thing, which I love. So imagine for some reason you were not all on mute and you were all actively talking to one another. And let's say you were talking about something kind of dicey. So what Beth's thing does is, as you were all talking, there would be this little thingy on the side that would monitor how dominant you would be, monitor your behaviors in real time, and you could adjust. It's really amazing. Then if you would find that would like just freak you out, you can not have it on your screen and it can show it later. And it's extremely, extremely fabulous in my opinion. So who am I and why am I talking? I've been invited by Beth because we moderated a different panel at a young company called Ace Up. So I'm Carol Kaufman. I know almost nothing about AI, etc., except what I've learned from Lindsay and Elizabeth and a few other people. I am the founder of the Institute of Coaching, and I'm an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, and I'm a visiting professor at Henley Business School. And what I'm interested in particular is how I can pull on the work with Elizabeth and Lindsay and Jennifer when she arrives in my work with CEOs and large companies to really be thinking through how some of these things can help the culture, the coaching, and the bottom line. So Lindsay is, her company is quite famous, and like zillions and zillions of people are using her work. And I'll let her kind of introduce herself and some of what she's doing.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Lindsay Crittenden, and I run a business at Headspace called Headspace for Work. Headspace is a mobile mindfulness and mental training application. We deliver content that helps build awareness and resilience via a mobile app that really anyone can download via the Android Play Store and the iOS Store. We have a division within our broader consumer business that works with companies around the world to help them really think through how mindfulness might apply to their culture, as well as how mental training might impact the bottom line for companies. Essentially, surround the human with as much support as possible in order to drive better business outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Can I jump in with a quick question? When you say mental training, okay, because I think we all know what mindfulness is. I think a lot of people don't know the very strong connections between mindfulness and peak performance, profit, and all that kind of stuff. Yep. But mental training, I bet they really don't know about that. And that's really
absolutely. So, obviously it is a very broad, you could define mental training in a lot of different ways. The ways that Headspace really thinks about it is helping, delivering content and certainly a few nudges and questionnaires and a little bit of tracking to help people really understand and gain awareness around what they're thinking about in the moment. And ideally getting to a point where something happens in your life and you're able to take a little pause before reacting to it. And so that's kind of what mental training means for Headspace, is really, you know, mindfulness there is a very strong link between mindfulness and meditation, and our ability to kind of step back, take a minute and respond with resilience and awareness.
So I want to kind of connect that to the real world for a moment. So
Please.
again, when I'm working with these CEOs and their excos, if they could do that, Lindsay, if they could do that moment of reflection before jumping in and back to Elizabeth, dominating or interrupting, that would really change a huge amount. So I see, Jennifer, you have joined us.
I've joined. Sorry about that. I did the Zoom otherworldly thing.
So did we. And you know, Jennifer just does massive amounts of work, is a major leader in the field, mentors lots and lots of people. And why don't you take a couple minutes and introduce yourself, Jennifer?
Sure. I come at this from a different direction. I'm usually an early stage investor, venture capitalist. I work on enterprise software, most commonly data-driven applications. So everything from Ginkgo Bioworks with synthetic biology was an investment I made while I was at Mass Ventures, to machine metrics and industrial IoT. And a couple of years ago, I left that firm and started working on a new project, an investment thesis around what will it take and where do we need to invest to get greater trust and transparency in AI and be able to manage it through its life cycle. And so I look a lot at issues of AI, bias and fairness, and both what's happening in the infrastructure and architecture and how people are thinking about it and what data we're missing to do it better. So.
Awesome.
Okay, so guys, this is, we're not setting this up as lecture. So as I put in the chat, you can either unmute and say something or put it in chat if you'd like, if you want us to go in a particular direction. So Beth, do you want to talk about what are the kinds of insights that AI can uniquely provide that humans can't quite get on their own, but frankly need to?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different domains, but keeping it sort of in the domain of, you know, human interaction and how we interact with one another in the workplace in particular, and how that sort of affects what's happening now in workplaces and right now in workplaces when we're all working remotely. What AI and new novel data collections can provide is insight around interaction, and in particular, things that you may or may not notice yourself when you're interacting with people online. So when you collect data about interactions in either video or text, AI is really good at noticing patterns that you may have biases for or against, right? So I may have a bias toward you, Carol, in all my interactions with you at the workplace. I'm like, every time Carol says something, I'm going to say something. And I may have a bias against Lindsay. I never react to her. I never say anything. I don't text her. I don't have a follow on. And those biases are usually things that we're pretty blind to as individuals. And so what AI can notice is that they can notice it for you. It can surface it. And that's just a simple example, but really a powerful one, because when you think about your role as a leader in an organization, it's meant to be fair-minded. You need to pay attention to all the people who are part of your organization, even those who you have challenging relationships with. And so while you may decide to cut that off because you find it difficult and you just don't want to do it a lot, and you may want to go toward people who make you comfortable and even confirm the biases that you have, AI can kind of keep you honest, right? And allow you through, and it's complicated, right? The behavioral modeling required to get that right is non-trivial. But when you get it right, it can really be an aid and augmentation to your own observations, which may have biases associated with them. I'll stop there.
So Jennifer, I would love to hear your comment on that from your perspective, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I think that Beth is absolutely right, that one of the most important things is we can both use AI to potentially surface biases. Like that's what I love about her tool as a woman who's actually been criticized for communicating the way I communicate. Her tool helps me keep me honest on those criticisms because it lets me see my feedback. It also is, so in that way, it's a way to combat bias, right? And I love that part because I have this inner belief that as women within these ecosystems, we keep hearing about our communication style as being a hindrance. And on some level, it's the next Me Too, the types of things that get written up in our recommendations and in our reviews are different than what gets said about men. And until now, we haven't had quantitative analysis that could let us know what's really happening in these meetings and communication. So in that way, it's really viable and valuable. On the other hand, I also have seen the extreme where I want to be really careful about how we think about what's in the training sets already in the AI that we're building and what types of inherent biases are reflected there. And the most egregious example I'll tell you is that I had a set of young founders come to me a few years ago and pitch me with a straight face that they were building a new HR AI that would solve this problem of how people interact and be totally objective. And the reason was because they weren't going to use human data to model their interactions at all. They were going to use apes. And I said, well, that's really interesting. But what kind of traits or what makes you think it will be inherently better for human interaction to model an AI that gives us advice about who to hire and how they'll perform in the workplace based on apes? And I said, well, what's the most, salient trait that's come out? And they said, oh, dominance.
Clearly they were not using bonobos.
Yeah.
So my mind is going in a couple of places, and then I'd love to pull in Lindsay. But, Beth, you were talking about, you got to get the behavioral modeling right, which is speaking to Jennifer. And then we have a question here about, which information are considered by the AI to determine your biases towards relationships with others? Fantastic question. So again, guys, as you have your questions, pop them in because we don't have like a song and dance ready for you and at the end. This is open, hopefully positive chaos. So Jennifer, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'll start, and I would like to hear Jennifer's thoughts on this as well, and Lindsay's. So we collect data in a lot of different ways. I know that many systems are looking at sort of what I'll call 3 legs of the stool. One is in the survey space. So surveys have become really popular, and you'd say, well, that thing you fill out about yourself every year called a performance evaluation, maybe not so good a tool, but a weekly, monthly survey, pulse poll about you and about your interactions with others. This is now becoming a really common way to sort of level set and see how are people feeling in the workplace, and how can that inform sort of almost like a mesh of information about what's actually happening, and people are using them increasingly. We don't use them as much in RIF, but that's a really interesting, sort of trend that's emerging. A second thing is more along the lines of what we're doing in the video domain, which is looking at and measuring every interaction that you have. Your interactions with others betray so much about you, who you decide to react to, even in very subtle ways. Right, just this second, Jennifer did something that was really interesting. I said something and she vigorously nodded because she is listening, and maybe she even agrees. Maybe that nod is not just a sort of a conversational motivator, it's actually agreement. And so that really subtle social cue that she just gave me encourages me to continue speaking. And if I don't do that, if I become neutral or I'm frowning, those cues are really both difficult to pick up and interpret, but increasingly easier to measure in the video space. So that's another kind of like direct measurement of interaction that is part of the, sort of the AI space that's emerging for this work, for work environments. The third one is taking all of that information and tracking it against performance, right? So in the end, we can all feel really good about our interaction domain, and that can have a very positive, like self-reinforcing sort of effect, a positive effect. But the company is going to be measuring us on our performance. How well do we execute on our tasks and our jobs? And what we've found is that these social signals, when you know about them, you use them to drive new behaviors, teams perform better.
Oh, there's so many things in there to
hold on, Jennifer.
jump in and
Okay, so I just wanted to support something about what you're saying in terms of the coaching and leadership world, which is the power of micro behaviors.
Yeah.
Little things. I once did an intervention with a guy who was the CHRO of a big organization, and in his board meetings, the blue blood woman who basically owned everything kept not paying attention to him, and he was feeling worse and worse and worse. So I gave a very powerful intervention, which was whenever she said something he really agreed with, he would go, that was it. That was the big intervention. Now, think about how AI might be able to capture this and help you with leadership. So what happened? So he did that, I said, don't do it so many times, you sound like a mouse, but every now and then, if you really agree, just go, Well, for the first time in 2 years of board meetings, after that meeting, she came over to him and started talking to him, which, by the way, sent ripples of power out given who she was. And this is the kind of micro behaviors that AI might be able to capture that in this case shifted the power, the power dynamics in a boardroom of a Fortune 50 company by going, So you cannot underestimate the power of that. So I just wanted to leap in. So
yeah, I think to
and
me,
then
those things are some of the most interesting things about how we'll be able to capture those things. How can we give this type of information in a way that feels safe and non-invasive to the employee? So in the case of Beth's platform, when she's talking about performance, it's not that it's reporting out everything you say and that you're always the master interrupter to your superiors or to your management team. It's actually giving you personalized feedback about what's happening, and then only showing an aggregate for the group about the dynamics in the group. And that creates some safety for you to hold yourself accountable, which I think ties into Lindsay. Before I turn it to Lindsay, the last thing I'll say, though, is we need to be very, very careful as we're building these systems that we have a deep enough, broad enough set of diverse data before we apply these universally, because those hmms and that body language and those elements vary dramatically, or can vary dramatically, culture to culture, socioeconomic background to other background. And so we want to make sure we have coverage before we say in a blanket way, hey, this is the positive affirmation, right? I can remember, I give the classic case of being in the executive meeting, sales meeting in Japan with 7 executives on one side of the table with our CEO, and we're having the conversation, and there were a few nods from the Japanese side of the table, and our CEO walked out and was like, I thought that went really well. And I thought, I didn't read that room the same way at all, because the cultural signals are totally different than ours.
Yeah.
And he kind of missed it. So I'll turn that to Lindsay now for how she's thinking about this in terms of safety, nudges, and behavior, and anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. So many things you just said are fascinating. I think the way to describe Headspace and really kind of the data and the information that we use, I want to kind of level set, which is, we build fairly thin profiles. We are founded by a monk and an ad agency executive, and so we've never really had it in our DNA to just absorb as much information as the internet might allow us. That said, we really focus on building a relationship with the end user in order for them, so the employee, in order for them to control all the data that ends up being collected in any sort of their account. And then that's not reported to employers as oh, Lindsay Crittenden is displaying a lot of distress. Boss, you need to go and actually do something about it. In fact, all of that information is presented back to the user of the application. So a really good example of that is stress measurement is one of the core uses of our application, alongside, utilizing content that really helps lower stress levels and helps train your brain to kind of relax a little bit, turn the amygdala off a little bit. And so, we, for instance, use surveys like Beth mentioned. So the perceived stress scale is a universally validated tool that we use. And that information actually just gets presented back to the member who's using the application. And then, the things that our employers are really curious about is, oh, how many people are using this? How frequently are they using this? The way that they really care about the performance of the application is in utilization, and very much at the high level aggregate level. The most specific we ever get is based on geography within a country, not even within necessarily a city or a specific division, because we're collecting information about what's going on between here and here, and there's nothing kind of more sensitive to that. Frankly.
Yeah, exactly.
Where does that take the rest of you here? What are you guys thinking the applications of that are? How that affects the organizations you work with?
Yeah, I'll dive in real quick, and then I'd love to hear Jennifer's point of view. I mean, for me, everything that you're doing in your own, in your own personal development at work, right, should be between you and whoever you want to share it with. So I think that there is definitely room for there to be an opportunity to reflect with others. And I think this is where, Carol, you and I have talked a lot about the effect on coaching and coaches, and sort of making the opportunity to get more data about yourself than you could get before, have more opportunities for reflection, and part of that reflection to happen with others. One of the things that's true about a really well-designed feedback mechanism, not just the AI that drives what you're putting on screen, but the feedback mechanism itself, is that it allows you to really understand what you're supposed to do now, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just data, but it's like urging, nudges you to go in a particular direction. And one of those directions might be, I know I have something that's going on here, and I don't know how to address it myself. So maybe that's something where my peers can get involved, and maybe that's something where I need a professional coach to get involved. So when I think about the kind of reflective data that I get in a sort of an automated or augmented workplace where I got AI and data being given back to me, I always want to know what the heck I'm supposed to do with it, right? And what action I'm supposed to take. And that's where I think sometimes people fall down. Like, well, I don't know what to, I have it now. I don't know what to do. So that's what I was thinking about somewhat when Lindsay was talking, that can be tricky for people. They don't always know what to do.
Yeah, it's incredibly, I mean, that's the hardest part of it, right? Having all the information in the world is not that helpful. I think one of the things that we found really interesting, and I've kind of seen in a couple of different places and companies, is the rejection or the acceptance of the feedback that you're getting, and how important that is. Ultimately, feedback is a gift sometimes, and sometimes that's how you end up receiving it when you see it. And then other times, kind of going back, not Headspace, but just mindfulness in general, that's where kind of coming back to that pause can be so helpful, in terms of, instead of just having a knee-jerk pushing it away, instead really having the opportunity to kind of think like, oh, okay. And then also, like, are you ready for that feedback? Are you actually ready to hear it? Is something that we've just seen as so critical. And it's a question that, I know, speaking specifically to coaches, are one of the places where they can kind of pop in and really augment some of this technology.
Yeah, to me, that's the part that gets, like, for all the parts that are tricky, this is the part where it gets most exciting, because as we start to have richer and richer data sets, the more we can have a better understanding of the dynamics that might be happening in different types of settings and conversations, and the more rich it is for the type of feedback that you could provide. And I think if you're building it in such a way that you're thinking about these things up front, so you're really building in the trust and transparency for your solution and your thought process about how you manage who owns the data, who sees the data, to create that safety for users, the more valuable it becomes. And then the insights get really, really rich. I keep thinking about Beth and I have talked quite a bit about the study that was done over at MIT Sloan in the last couple of years. 2 women looked at, hey, what really are the dynamics in our small group meetings with executives and MBAs? And what they found was in those meetings, the data does show that usually when there's a group meeting, it's the women who are getting interrupted. And it was kind of nice to see the quantitative evidence, but then it was even more interesting to discover that when women were repeatedly interrupted, their own behavior changed over time, and they split into 2 pools. They became either much more passive and just disengaged, or they became master interrupters. But when they became master interrupters, they didn't interrupt the men who were interrupting them. They interrupted other women because we've internalized the bias.
Yeah.
And so this is a place where this technology is so rich in being able to surface those types of things and keep us honest. And for the first time have sort of quantitative view of what does internalized bias look like, as opposed to a policy discussion, which is sort of where all of AI trust is living right now. We're starting to get into the how do you implement and what do you learn from it?
Yeah. Yeah. I want to pick up on something you're saying there, Jennifer, because I think it's really apropos in that you may observe something that you think is true, only to learn later that you can't, you don't have enough, you're not able to escape your own biases enough to be able to really come up with a view that's observational in the way that the AI is observational. So that was an unexpected result, because if you were just watching what was happening, you might mistake this interruption pattern that Jennifer was just talking about, because it seemed like women, some of the women got more forceful and came out of their shells and started speaking more, but the pattern of them always interrupting other women, we weren't looking for that. We didn't know that was coming, right? That was just a really interesting finding. And I'm not sure, we might have discovered it over time, but it sort of accelerated our discovery of that piece of information, which was really, really revealing. There's a couple interesting questions in the chat I noticed. And let's see what we got here. Oh, somebody asked about being observed versus not being observed.
Schrodinger's cat, anyone?
Yeah, exactly. I can weigh in on that, but I would like to hear about other people's thoughts here. So yeah, we commonly people ask us, well, aren't people going to change their behavior if you give them real-time feedback on screen while they're talking? And the answer is, of course they are. Absolutely. That is part of the value and the intent of a real-time feedback mechanism. You want people to observe it, and you want them to take an opportunity to change their behavior if it moves them to do so. The upside, obviously, is that we're trying to create a space where people can actually speak freely and feel like they're being heard and have an opportunity to be part of a conversation, and dampen dominant voices. That's a lot of what the sort of core thesis of our software is. On the other hand, we don't want it to become so heavyweight that people feel stilted in their conversations and that don't feel like they can be naturalistic in the way that they're interacting with one another. So getting that right and getting that subtle piece of feedback it's really difficult, and really requires an enormous amount of research. It's actually one of the things I was hoping we could talk about a little bit today, is sort of research and the role it plays in the ongoing development of these nudging systems, because it's you don't want to nudge people without knowing what the, at least in some large measure, what the net effect is going to be. And I know, Lindsay, you guys are working on nudging on in Headspace, and you've done that before in your work. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, science is the only way, right? I know maybe that's a controversial statement in our
we just
society
say
today,
that science is the only way.
But
ground truth,
really,
good ground truth.
yeah, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm sure, but I think the truth is that the only way that you can even get anyone bought into a lot of what we're going to be asking people to do to improve the workplace is by providing some sort of evidence. I think what's really interesting, and a question that I ask, and I haven't really seen it, is that there's a lot of, back to kind of DE&I, is that there's a lot of allyship training. There's a lot of, like corporate training that's happening around this right now. What I haven't really seen in any of those is a lot of, there's some peer-reviewed work that gets pulled into that to kind of help set the stage. But some of this real-time AI feedback, I haven't really seen that nested in with any sort of the very practical, like practical work that happens in some of these workshops. And so, I really wonder, both because you want to have responsible nudges, but are we marrying what we practice and what we actually are seeing inside these organizations? Have you guys seen that anywhere? Is that anything that we know is more or less effective?
I think that's a fascinating question. So I will tell you that I don't know enough to know that I've seen it. I don't think I've seen it in the real-time training, like somebody using something like what Beth is doing, or using the type of platform you're doing, and then embedding it into the DEI training. I have not seen that yet. Where we do see some advances like that are, you have companies like Blendor or Textio that are taking the written language and saying, hey, when you're evaluating these people's applications for jobs, you're trying to avoid bias in the language and in the phrasing that you're looking for. In Textio's case, they'll review your job descriptions before you put it out to make sure you're not embedding language that turns off women or turns off people of color, or only attracts white men in spades, that type of thing. We've seen Blendor do that by trying to anonymize resumes. We see Metrics making claims to do that because of the types of behavioral assessments they do. I personally have more wariness on those because we have such a spectrum of people's brain experiences. But the other one that I've seen recently is called Pipeline Equity. And what Pipeline is doing is they've really done the data work. And it's not necessarily AI, but on surfacing in the reviews of people, what types of language is being used, and also how that ties to pay, performance, and promotion. So they are the first company that's out there really being able to quantify what that gap is and how it relates to these other things. So I think we're on the cusp of a place where the sort of real-time feedback can tie into the other areas where we're making moves, and we'll see those first links of like policy and best practices, like changing your process through services and training with behavioral data to support that, right? And the ability to quantify it.
Yeah, there's some merging spaces. I know, Carol, you did some early research in tone of voice, and I haven't seen anything that's become that advanced yet, where you can really get it down to the absolutely smallest set of it. Like, so Jennifer, you're talking about picking out just words and languages and phrases and using all of that data to really build a model of what the communication space looks like when you're hiring or onboarding, right, or interacting with one another in the workplace. But even something as almost imperceptible as tone, right? Can have a huge effect. Like if I say, well, I'll let Carol tell the story because she's got an
utterance, tone, and implication, right? Yeah. Carol, go tell the story.
Tell the story. It's so awesome.
Okay. I wrote a HBR article a couple of months ago called "Without Compassion, Resilient Leaders Fall Short." Where that was coming from is I did research a long time ago on voice tone and its toxic impact on people. So this was back in the clinical world, and we did numbers of studies where you would interview someone for an hour. Okay, so Beth would be interviewed on Jennifer for an hour, all about Jennifer and Jennifer's level of function and how she operated with other people, how clean is her office, everything. And if in that 1 hour, we rated that you had from 4 to 6, what they call critical comments, you could predict her behavior in the following way. So I'll tell you what a critical comment is. So let's say Jennifer's office is messy, and that's just really bothering Beth for some reason. Beth could say, hold on, the train's coming by. Beth could say, Jennifer, you know, your office is a mess. Or she could say, Jennifer, your office is a mess. Jennifer, your office is a mess. Okay, or she could say, Jennifer, your office is a mess. Now, can you hear that? That is this contemptuous voice tone. You know, Lindsay, why are you nodding? You know, Beth, what's this with smiling? And Pearl, your picture of which is actually very cute, of the little
Adorable
bunny rabbit. But this voice tone is a very powerful predictor. And in these clinical studies, what they found, which blew everybody's brains, is that when you have people with major depression, schizophrenia, just dysthymia, etc., whether you are exposed to this kind of critical voice tone by someone with whom you lived, predicted relapse more powerfully than if they took their medication or not. So now if you think about it, I don't know how many of you here have ever had a boss or someone who talked to you like that, and what it does to you. And there was Robert Lord and some people at Stanford did structural equation modeling on toxic leaders, and what is it on the other side of all that leads to poor performance? You know, is it like you just hate the person and so you're on strike? What they found when they did the structural equation modeling, that what was so powerfully toxic about this voice tone was that the recipient basically lost not their self-esteem, their sense of agency, and in a way it separated them from themselves, and they were less effective. So this is an example, I think, of like the future, because I mean, I was trained, and the bunch of us who were researchers were all trained with a good inter-rater reliability to measure this voice tone. And I bet vocal analysis could do it way quicker than us. But that would be very powerful. An example of how AI actually might be a good partner that actually could lead to healing, because you could have this be detected, and then you could see how things were tanking, and then find someone like me who could come in and work with that leader, because often they don't realize the impact they're having.
Yeah, they don't, right. And we can't all be there to be the expert listener like you. So I was just really moved by this story of how, you know, like it's really laborious to do these kinds of studies. And if you can get a body of voice recordings, or you can be actively monitoring for that tone and start to teach an AI what to be listening for, you could accelerate this kind of discovery and then surface it in the same way that all this other data that we're talking about surfacing. And it's just such an unexpected potential place of discovery that's even just so far beyond what we can do right now. But you know, it seems more and more possible every day with new AI. So I just thought it was a really interesting.
And I think that type of surfacing really ties into the part of where could you make a leap on diversity and inclusion, and helping people understand the subtle signals that say you don't belong, right? That we don't realize that we're giving up, or the miscued reads of somebody's response. Because I think that's what we see a lot happening with, especially with female leaders and subordinates who are rising up the ladder, is that the way that you communicate and the way that you get presented, it looks different. And a lot of times the feedback that you get is you're not doing it right versus we're not reading it right. So
I just want to have one question. There's a question in the chat, but I just have one question.
Wait. I'm going to interrupt. Lindsay's been nodding up a storm, and what I would love to hear, because we were sort of on the track of the future. So Beth
Yeah.
was talking about the future of, AI in this way, to us to partner with AI might look in this refinement for vocal tone, gestures, etc. And I'm thinking about like nudges, like what's the future of nudges, like how responsive they might be in the moment. Where do you see that going?
I'm a little conflicted to answer the question. I'll refer back to something that I said earlier, which is there's a lot of nuance in whether or not you're willing to respond or accept feedback. And I think that's probably one of the things, the ability to somewhat assess that so that you're able to meet people in the moment. That's one of the things that we talk a lot about is I'm diagnosed with anxiety. And so I might be much more receptive to someone who's like, I'm perfectly fine. I just don't sleep well at night. I don't need anything other than a sleep solution. And so there's a whole lot of figuring out, I think, of where you are and just the receptiveness that I'm not sure we've really figured out how to assess that outside of, surveys and scales that have been around a long time. And that's not real time. That's, analysis over time. So in other words, I'm not actually quite sure that we're solving kind of the core part of the problem yet.
So you're saying, how do we get to the place where what we're providing for people as tools to support their behavior and the communication in the workplace is actually opening the place for receptiveness to change?
Yeah, exactly.
And
yes, precisely.
That's why I think these tools, even where they are right now, and then the data, the fact that you're able to look at the data longitudinally for the first time gives you some ability to start to think about that. I mean, I think we're right on the cusp, right?
Yeah.
I'll share my personal story. I was criticized for being the person who didn't come with everything all packaged up in a certain way to communicate, because I like to talk things through. The other person didn't. And was criticized for interrupting, but felt like I was always being interrupted and frankly treated with, now I know from Carol's example yesterday, I was like, oh, it was actually, I was at the point where I was being treated with contempt, and therefore I felt increasingly unsure and kind of gaslighted and didn't know which way to move. It made me very unreceptive to feedback at the same time. So what changes with these tools is the ability to look objective just at yourself first, and to see it in the context of the larger meeting communication or what's going on with others, an aggregate in your company or in your team. If your team has a high level of stress and you're also stressed, you might feel a little safer, right? Especially if you knew that, oh, it's not just me, my whole team's under pressure. I just am here. It gives you some room to move, right?
Yeah. That segues to Umar's question perfectly. Like as the, you're saying here it is in this little team, but here it is through the organization. So I'd love to hear your comments on, what's your vision for the future as the technology becomes more ubiquitous in the workplace, or as Julia Darr, who is a nudge woman at BCG, says, can you rate it on a scale of 0 to creepy? So I think that's great. What's the future? What's the future of this stuff as it spreads?
So I talk about this a lot, and this is something that Headspace really thinks about a lot, which is the future is certainly more advanced information and better models and better data, but it's taking it out of the places and the companies where you might expect it to live. Like if you say, oh, Google is doing X, it's like, well, of course Google is doing that. If you say Siemens is doing X, it's a little more interesting. And so that's actually Headspace's general thesis, is that there's a whole 98% of the world doesn't have access to even the most basic information. And our belief is that in the future, that cannot be the case for any of this stuff to be really effective. And so, just spreading out outside of the bubbles that frankly, anyone who's on this panel and in this room might just kind of take for granted.
Yeah, I'll second that and then promote something that I know Jennifer is working on, and then she can talk about it a little bit more, which is that I think what you're talking about is that, the AIs that we have the most acquaintance with are those that are prevailed upon by the giant tech companies that are sort of pervasive everywhere and that we have the most intersection with in our personal lives. But the place that, you know, where we can really use the help to get it right and not get it wrong is in framework development and making sure that as companies start to adopt AI strategies, particularly about this really personal domain of interaction and microaggression and, you know, your mental headspace and whatever else is part of the sort of like human dimension of work and the behavioral dimension of work, that workplaces need some guidance and they need some tools to make sure that when they put something in place, it actually does preserve people's privacy, is not embedded with biases, that it's really there to help them, their employees first and foremost, but then them see the benefit without having to see all the data. And that's really tricky. So I don't know, Jennifer, I'll hand it off to you because I know you're very in this space. So
So many things in there. So I think the first thing I would say is that, you know, I have a vision that you can really see some of this stuff used for good. I think that to get there, you need several things. First, we have gone a long way and let a lot of very powerful interests say sort of this is the status quo and there's no going back.
right.
And that stuff, that slope that we've walked down is really hard to win back. And so I think it's very interesting that Lindsay says maybe the place to do it isn't in the place where you usually expect. That's the most tech forward, but it's in the broader ecosystem with the companies that you don't expect, where you might have a chance to do things with a really different perspective and a lot more sensitivity.
Yes.
I think that's something that we have to come for. We also have to prioritize both for ROI and for safety and longevity of people, as well as these technologies we might want to build or use. We have to prioritize trust, transparency, and accountability. And we have to do it not just from the process, policy, ethics conversation, but we actually have to look at what tools do we implement along the way? What processes do we implement along the way in the design and rollout of these technologies and their production lives, that we can manage them with greater responsibility and accountability. What do I mean? You need life cycle manage. You need to know which experiments you ran as you built these models. You need a deep understanding of what data went in there and where it came from and how it might change over time, or what you're applying to it might be changing over time, so they're no longer in sync. Right? Those pieces are kind of architectural pieces. And then there's the, how do we make sure that we're filling the data gaps? If we don't know, is there someone out there doing this research on a population that doesn't look as white and European as most of it does, right? So that that data can become part of the ground truth. Anyway, so I rambled on there a little bit, but you see that I see this vision that this stuff is beautiful and extremely powerful, and yet we want to be very thoughtful about how and where we apply it, lest we have those guerrilla examples.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Lindsay, I just have one follow-up question for you on that. So in your, you know, in your relationship that you build with each company, to what degree are you building sort of a general sort of set of data that can run across companies versus building a really specific set of sort of AIs or conclusions or insights or whatever you want to call them just for that company? Because I can see that being a really interesting dynamic between what is sort of it's everywhere, it's universal truth somehow, or it's like, no, it's Siemens and Siemens works like this and that's a thing, you know. Sorry to call
but no, of course. I know, of course. There's a role that we play both in benchmarking, because we work with a breadth of companies, as well as helping companies understand, you know, where they are and what their patterns are. The reality of the situation, you start with benchmarking, because the benchmarking in and of itself, like companies that are in manufacturing and, you know, industrials, this is kind of what they look like. And we look at things like, you know, we index some different scores and stuff like that to help inform where a company might be. But for us, a company has really got to be willing to make a deeper commitment to say, okay, well, we want to know what's best for Siemens. And sometimes there's an organizational will from the very top, the CEO, who's like, I want to know what's going on with Siemens. And then in other companies, you know, it might be a benefits manager who really can't kind of control that, but all they can really do is present, excuse my lighting, everyone. I'm on the West Coast, and so the sun is coming up. You know, I think the reality is that there are just some companies where that's not really ever going to be the case. And so we try to present the best that we can within the degree of the sophistication that those companies have. And the senior leadership have to be part of that. If you really want to understand your own company, you cannot do it from the outside in. It's got to be from the inside out.
Yeah, I would also say that this, like, I think that's absolutely the point, and I want to emphasize that I'm an investor, I'm a capitalist, but I think that the way to work on this the best is to find the best of the best who are being extremely thoughtful about these elements, and then look at where you can implement it for the greatest impact, and watch both the results and also how you manage it, right? I think that those are the pieces that make success. What we hear over and over, though, is that things that are done without that degree of thoughtfulness or without building in the infrastructure for trust up front, those things are the things that fail in the long run or have the unexpected consequences. But when you're thoughtful, like these two companies have been from the get-go, about privacy, about diversity, about what you really are able to say and what you should measure, and you resist the urge that organizations have to say, but I want to use it in this way, which is hard to do as a startup.
Yeah.
Right? It's really hard to do because you need to sell. Those are the ones that are going to make the real leaps and be transformational.
And then we've got this great kind of dark question. You know, what do you do when you've got that CEO, and let's say that CEO is a little bit on the sociopathic side and suddenly believes in AI and nudges, and you know, and yes, you're supposed to be able to opt out, but let's say the culture is, oh, she opted out. Did you know that Lindsay opted out of this? What do you think? So just, you know, very interesting is what can we do about that so that we really can put these ethics in place, have safeguards? So
yeah, I mean, you could make sure that a CEO can't know that. I mean, you know, you could just make sure that it is literally unknown. If you're building the relationship directly with the employee, certainly that should be a standard, especially if you're following like just industry best practices. Just that they shouldn't know that. They should know what's aggregate and what's trending, but any given individual, that's just not the way to do it. I guess I can't just stop saying that, but it's just the truth. And honestly, and this is just a business practice that is hard, but is absolutely worth it, which is essentially think for the long term. When you are a younger company and you are, you know, you're a startup and you're just doing everything you can to make your business work, when it comes to issues like this, you have got to think for the relationship for the next 10 years, and you have one or two of those clients, it can take your whole business down because you're learning the wrong things, you're doing the wrong things, you're optimizing for the wrong things, you compromise your integrity. It's 10 years later, you're going to look back and that's going to be really painful.
Yeah, I would say that very much a companion thought to that. We had an early relationship with a company and they really, 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 really wanted the data. And we said no. And I knew that in saying no, and I won't get into all the details of it, but in saying no, we could lose them as a customer.
Yeah.
And I was, you know, I really was willing to lose the customer because the data was not appropriate for them to see that low level of data about every interaction of people in their company. It just was not appropriate. It was a violation of everything that we stood for in terms of data privacy and, you know, having ownership over your data yourself. And but we knew, you know, it would come with risk, and we did it anyway, just because I think this is just a really, really dangerous territory. And the minute you do it once, that's it.
Exactly.
And
so really good governance and regulations. So it's 2 minutes of the hour, and we probably want to let people have a minute in between now and the next thing. How about just one sentence each from Jennifer, Lindsay, and Beth? You get the last word. So one last nugget, Jennifer.
Well, I guess the last nugget is I'm excited for these opportunities. I'm excited for the ability of us to look at ourselves and understand how we're engaging with other people and how we're engaging with our brains in a much more deep way. and then to use that to really augment humans. I always have believed that the best of technology is technology that lifts us all up. So that's my last part.
That's
Yeah,
certainly
and
good with you, Lindsay. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it definitely, I agree with all of that. I think the other thing, I'll just go back to, I say this on every single panel, which is please, as technologists, think about how your technology can impact a broader swath of people with regard to socioeconomic status and geography. We continue to have this idea, and I'm in Silicon Valley, so I'm a little more biased on this, but we continue to have this idea that we should keep building for ourselves. And the difference between someone who's really concerned with like a beautiful risotto and getting a promotion is really different from someone who's concerned about getting injured on a job and being on disability for the rest of their lives. And so AI can complement a number of different work processes and ideas in the workplace. And so so think outside of our respective bubbles, and I hope that we can solve the problem of getting this technology out to a much broader employee population.
Thank you. Beth, the last word. I'm
interested in trust. I believe that it's really important to trust people first, foremost, and forever if you can, until they give you a reason not to. And I think for all too many years, we've taken the, I don't trust my employees. I don't trust what they're doing and how they're working. And there's all this surveillance technology around that. And I would like to take trust back and make it a part of the foundational, fundamental way in which we treat each other and we treat our employees, and our employees treat us in the workplace, up, down, sideways, everywhere. We need to bring back trust. And this can be a way to do that if done correctly.
And I've really learned, again, more deeply how AI is a partner. So on that note, thank you. I see, can I access these talks and panels? I'm not sure who to address that question to. So my guess is someone who's hosting the conference should have.
The organizer can, this is a recorded session, so I think we can get it out to folks somehow.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, everybody.